You should be able to see that. Is that
Yeah,
okay?
looking good.
Yeah, perfect. I'll just minimize you as well, George, no offense. Okay, thank you very much. In 2019, a metal detectorist discovered a miniature bronze-socketed axe head from Moorbattle in the Scottish borders. A rare find, it provides an impetus to draw together a range of unusually small socketed axe heads recorded from Scotland and Northern England and discuss them in a British context. So this talk really presents a whirlwind overview of this research, due to be published later this month. For the first time, a range of scientific analyses have been applied to this object type to inform discussions of wear analysis, material composition, manufacture, and chronology. Before we get going, a brief note on definitions. In Scotland, the Moorbattle axe head was the first find of its type to be discovered for more than 20 years. But metal detecting and excavations in England and Wales have resulted in the discovery of a much larger number of small socketed axe heads. These have recently been discussed in some detail by Alex Bliss, who created a typological and chronological framework for over 150 objects, underpinned by finds from datable contexts. Though comprehensive for England and Wales, the research didn't consider finds from Northern Britain, and that's partly because of data accessibility, but it's also partly owing to the criteria used to define miniature axe heads. So miniature objects are traditionally defined as objects that represent small versions of everyday objects, but are clearly non-functional, and this might be indicated by their crude design, their highly stylized forms, or production of materials unsuitable for use. This is quite broadly accepted, and while it applies to a small number of the small socketed axes that we see from Northern Britain, it doesn't, however, account for a wide diversity of forms that we see across our data set, or those examples which fit most of the criteria for miniature, but may have plausibly functioned as small tools. So we're therefore suggesting a second definition which fills this existing research gap and captures objects that are otherwise excluded from the traditional definition of miniature. So we're going to add in diminutive, which are axe heads that are recognisably smaller versions of larger axe heads and were conceivably functional. So that is, they share the morphological features of their larger counterparts, but are roughly half the size or smaller. And it's worth noting it excludes classes of functional axe heads that were simply small, such as the Yorkshire type from the Late Bronze Age. The examples from Northern Britain complete the British data set, following on from Alex Bliss's work, and it brings a total of small socketed axe heads from Northern Britain to 11. So within those 11, there are 5 diminutive axe heads, so the plausibly functional type, 2 miniatures, 3 which straddle both definitions, we can't quite make our minds up, and another which has an uncertain classification. Northern Britain, for the purposes of this paper, comprises Scotland and the 2 English border counties of Cumbria and Northumberland. The distribution of small axe heads within the data set is centred on southern Scotland and Northumberland. While we might expect to see this due to higher levels of metal detecting in these areas, actually only half of the axe heads presented in the paper are actually metal detected finds. And the general cluster around the modern Anglo-Scottish border continues the distributional trend we see in earlier work. And it's worth noting that the 2 Highland examples, numbers 1 and 5 on the map there, from Poolewe and Newtonmore, stand out as really quite significant northerly outliers. In terms of context of deposition, most axe heads were recovered as single finds. The details of find spots and circumstances are often really difficult to clarify. Some have hints of associated finds, for example, and that's good following on from Edward's paper. And others we can more confidently place in wetland contexts. The Muirfield axe head, actually, which is on the screen there for you, was described in 1928 by its finder to be of more than ordinary interest, a quote from which we derive the title of our paper. It was found in sand dunes close to a burial feature, presumed at the time to be Bronze Age in date. The feature's lost, and it's worth noting that we don't have any evidence that it's come from a mortuary context, especially considering the dynamism of a sand dune environment. But that said, the Poolewe axe head is the only example recovered from a hoard, which was discovered in the Northwest Highlands in 1877 during peat cutting, along with a diminutive axe head, which is circled there in red, which is similar in form to larger transitional type axes of the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. And there were 4 full-size Sompting axe heads, and one of those had a partial haft which could be carbon dated. The results suggested that it was probably produced at the end of the 9th century BC and deposited at some point in the 8th, and those results are published. So while most of the diminutive axe heads in our dataset compare well to larger versions of Late Bronze Age axe head types, earliest Iron Age, the Poolewe example there is the top right of the 2 within that segment, and early Iron Age forms The pool U is the only example in the dataset which actually offers greater chronological precision, although this similarity to larger forms gives a broad idea of their likely temporal currency. And then at the other end of the scale, we have an example which is clearly non-functional. It has exaggerated features, it has no socket, and is only decorated on one face. And at this point in the very late Iron Age and Roman period, we're going to start thinking about the changing function and symbolism of axe heads through later prehistory. It's worth noting that this is largely stylistic for now, and Matt's going to come back to this later, but I'm going to pass over to him now to introduce some of the analytical science techniques we use for this paper.
Thank you, Ella. I hope you can all hear me. What Ella's presented so far is a fairly typical approach to small socketed axe heads in terms of assessing their typochronology. But what we wanted to do, and what we were able to do because of the relatively small size of our data set, is we wanted to apply a wider range of scientific analyses to these to help understand their potential function and manufacture. And we were able to access 7 of the 11 objects, and our analyses included X-ray fluorescence, computed X-radiography, and microscopic wear analysis with the help of Dr. Laure Trelayan at the National Museum's Collection Centre. We'd hoped that applying XRF would show some compositional details that might help with the chronology. So if we detected levels of zinc in the copper alloy, that would rule out a late Bronze Age date, for instance. Unfortunately, everything came back as leaded bronze, leaded tin bronze. So this didn't really help us, though we were able to do some relative compositional work, which showed that one of our examples had an inflated level of lead content. Next slide, please, Ella. More productive was our radiographic analysis, where what we were looking for were signs of the casting quality, as well as the sort of depth of socket. If we're trying to explore the idea that some of these things are functional, there's certain things that a functional axe needs, or functional tool needs to have, and that is a long enough socket that could take in a haft. And this was particularly useful for the Moore-Battle example, which is number 11 at the bottom of the slide there, which was still in an unconserved state and was filled with soil. So we were able to see that the socket does indeed extend all the way to the cutting edge, as you would expect for a functional axe head. By contrast, number 6, which you see on the right hand, to all intents and purposes looks like a functional axe head, but the socket is actually relatively short, and in asymmetric nature, where it's flatter on one side than it is on the other, creating an almost wedge-like shape, which suggests it may not be functional in that it can't be hafted, or it wouldn't have functioned as you would expect a typical axe to function. Next slide, please. We coupled these analyses with more traditional wear analysis through optical and digital microscopy. Some of the axe heads didn't lend themselves to this due to surface treatment through old conservation, where they've lacquered the surface, or taphonomic processes that have meant that some of the surfaces are quite abraded or corroded now. But there was one example which showed the promise of analysing these axes in more detail, and that was the axe head from Bellingham in Northumberland. And this showed signs of greater polishing around, polishing and working around the upper body and sockets, showing signs of preparation, and significantly around the cutting edge. We were able to see striations that were consistent with the patina of the axe, and these suggest certainly signs of sharpening or working of that cutting edge. Though this ties into a larger problem that we have with socketed axes at the moment that we still are relatively early on in understanding what these striations specifically relate to. And more work is needed here to understand the use, the relationship between these marks and use. So, what does this collection of analyses allow us to say? I think it's quite significant, or we think it's quite significant, that while there are smaller versions of axe heads appearing throughout the Bronze Age, there's small flat axes that are produced, small power staves, for instance. They're relatively rare, and small socketed axe heads seem to be increasingly recognized as dating from around this sort of period. And that ties in with a diversifying tool set where um, there are gouges, chisels, knives, objects that must have existed in some form previously, but in the late Bronze Age, it becomes really they become really quite prolific. So we can start to think about the idea that not all axes will have been axes, and these small examples, the diminutive examples that could have plausibly been functional, I think we need to think more carefully about their role as potential tools. And it's why it's important that they're included in our data set. It's also quite significant, as Ella noted, that many of the smaller versions that we were looking at showed greatest morphological parallels with larger forms in the earliest Iron Age. Many could be recognized essentially as miniature Sompting types. And this period around 800 to 600 BC and a little bit beyond is significant because larger axe heads at this time are being produced in both functional and non-functional states. Large, heavy Sompting axes were clearly very good for woodworking, but linear faceted types that you see in southern England and northern France were often produced in very high lead or high tin contents, which would have made them very brittle and completely afunctional for use as an actual axe head. So what we argue that we're seeing is by including all these additional axe heads, we're seeing a transformation of a scaling down of axe heads, turning them from small functional tools into more symbolic versions of themselves. Certainly by the Middle Iron Age, socketed axe heads, larger socketed axe heads, are an archaic form. They aren't being produced in iron, they're not being produced in bronze. So any miniature versions that are appearing at that time must be harking back to this earlier era. And we know they're appearing at this time because we have examples like the one from the Middle Iron Age grave at Arras, where a miniature axe head was formed as a pendant. We know in the Roman period they're being produced in small forms as well, often found at temple sites. And you also see crude forms being produced at midden sites. It's so what we're seeing is a transformation of this role from larger socketed axes into smaller forms and eventually miniaturized into a symbolic version of themselves. And by including this full spectrum of small socketed axe heads, we can start to explore the diversity in the chronology, the use, and the meaning of these things. So we hope you agree these are indeed of more than ordinary interest. And on that note, we're going to do a shameless plug for our paper coming soon to a journal near you, published at the end of this month in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And it remains only for us to thank a whole host of people who have contributed to this research.